In this video, I'm going to look at how to read specific information from the graphs of functions. So looking at my first graph, I need to find the domain and the range. Remember, the domain are the x values, the range are the y values. And the way I like to find my domain and range is using a straight edge. So looking at the domain first, remember I'm going to start coming in from the left-hand side. So here's my straight edge, and when I first come in, is there a graph here? No, I don't have any graph. What is the first x value I come across? It's the x value associated with that point, so that x value is going to be -4. Is there a point when x equals -4? Yes, I have a solid circle, so I have to include -4, so I'm going to use a square bracket. And where does my domain go to? Well, looking at my graph, it keeps going, it keeps going, it keeps going, and look at that arrow. That points that this graph is going to keep going forever in the right-hand direction. So my x values are going to keep going to positive infinity. And remember, we always use parentheses when dealing with infinity and negative infinity. Now to find the range, I bring my straight edge coming in from negative infinity in the y direction. And as I come on up, do I have a graph here? No. What is the smallest y value I come across? It's the y value associated with this point, so it is y equals 1. And as I have a solid dot there, I include the endpoint, so I have square bracket 1, comma, and now how far does my range extend? Well, it keeps going up, and if you notice this arrow indicates the graph keeps going up and to the right. So my graph is going to extend to y equals positive infinity. Next, I need to find f of 5. Remember, 5 is replacing the x value. So this says go to the graph and find a point where x equals 5. Well, x equals 5 here. Is there a point on the graph? Yes, right there. And what is the y value? 4. So f of 5 equals 4. In the next part, we need to find x, so I'm not given x, such that f of x equals 2. Remember, f of x is the same as the y value. So this says y equals 2, find the x value. So if I look on my graph, here's y equals 2. Is there a point where y equals 2? Yes, right there. And what is its x value? -3. So we know when x equals -3, y equals 2. Next, find the x-intercepts. Does this graph cross the x-axis? No. So there are no x-intercepts. Lastly, does this graph cross the y-axis? Yes, right here. Remember, intercepts are ordered pairs. Every y-intercept has an x-coordinate of 0, and what's the y-coordinate? +3. Looking at my second graph, starting with the domain, bringing in my straight edge from the left, the first time it encounters the graph is with this arrow. That indicates this graph is going to keep going to the left and will approach negative infinity. So my domain will be parentheses negative infinity, comma, and how far will it go to the right? It's going to keep going to this point, but notice I then have a break in the graph. So my domain is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to end at this point here where x equals -3, but since there's an open circle, I use parentheses since it is not included. Now, unioned with the second part of the domain that's going to start at this point here, I'm going to include it since it's a solid circle, so that's at -2. So I'm going to have square bracket -2, comma, and how far does this one go to the right? Well, the graph keeps going and going and going, and notice I have an arrow at this end that indicates the graph is going to keep going to positive infinity in the x direction and negative infinity in the y direction. And so the domain goes to positive infinity, which we can just write as infinity with a parentheses on it. Now we need to look at the range, the y values coming in from down below when y equals negative infinity. Is there a graph here? Be careful. You might be tempted to say this range starts when y equals -6. But look at the arrow on the end of the graph. This indicates this graph keeps going to the right and down, and so in the y direction, the graph will approach negative infinity. And then the graph goes up, keeps going up until it reaches this point here, and then we have a break in the graph. There is a point right here, and what is its y value? It is 3. So my range goes to 3. And since there's a point when y equals 3, I put a square bracket. So the first part of the range is parentheses negative infinity, comma 3 square bracket, unioned with the last y values right here. And there's just one y value here, and that's y equals 4. So you just write that in set notation as the point 4. So now I've finished the domain and range. The next thing we need to find is f of -5. This means x equals -5. Find the y value. When x equals -5, what's the y value? There's the point right here, and its y value is 4. Next, we need to find x such that f of x equals -3. Remember, that means y equals -3. So is there a point when y equals -3? If you look at the horizontal line, y equals -3, it crosses the graph twice. Once here when x equals -1, and the other time when x equals 7. Next, are there any x-intercepts? Yes, the graph crosses the x-axis here and here. Remember, the y-coordinate of every x-intercept is 0. What are the coordinates of this point? It's the origin, so it's 0, 0. And this x-intercept has the coordinates 4, 0. Lastly, is there a y-intercept? Yes. The graph crosses the y-axis at the origin, so its coordinates are 0, 0.